You're listening to the 40 Fit Radio podcast, dedicated to the 40-plus community. Join us as we discuss the truth about fitness and health using science, reason, and the experiences of our host and content experts. Welcome to the 40 Fit Nation. Hey, welcome back to 40 Fit Radio, and welcome back to the 40 Fit Nation. I'm one of your hosts, Coach D, and Coach Trent is in the house.
And I am the non-40 guy over here.
You're 40 in your mind. You're mature like 40. You're mature like 40.
Is that good or bad?
That's good.
Okay.
That's good. You're not 40 in your body, which is a good thing.
Yeah.
But you're 40 in your mind. And
okay,
so today,
I'll take that.
Oh, man. Welcome to America. If you are listening from abroad, welcome to America.
Texas.
To Texas, yeah. This is
we fly our state flag alongside
That's
the
correct.
American flag,
That's
not beneath. That's
yeah,
right.
I think the American flag is flown always, if you're looking at them, on the left-hand side, and the Texas flag can be flown on the right-hand side when you're viewing them. If you're looking out from them, obviously just the opposite.
At equal heights.
Yes,
so
correct.
no other
Yes,
state
correct.
flags fly at equal height,
That's right.
I believe.
Booyah.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of people, okay, so even if you're listening from another state, or if you're listening from across the pond or in another country, a lot of people don't recognize that Texas was its own nation.
That's right. Yeah.
1836, Texas Declaration of Independence, and we were our own nation for a short period of time before being accepted into the Union and then becoming part of the United States of America.
Ooh, yeah. I don't even know off the top of my head. When was statehood granted?
You know, I should
see.
know that because
Okay,
I am a Texas history buff, but I want to say it was around in the 1840s.
Yes.
If I'm not
I just
correct.
looked it up.
Okay, 1843 or
Close.
45?
Very close. 45. Yeah.
45.
That's right. So
okay,
the very end of
1845. Yeah. So we were only our own nation from 1836 to 1845. Texas Declaration of Independence was signed on Washington on the Brazos in Texas, and my fourth great grandfather was a signer of the Declaration of Independence of Texas.
Yeah.
His name was George Washington Smythe, and he rode on horseback when he was 23 years old from Tennessee to Texas and became the second land commissioner appointed by Stephen F. Austin to survey the boundary lines of North Texas. And actually, he is equated with surveying the Texas-Oklahoma boundary line, which was really considered the Texas-U.S. boundary line at the time when they became a nation, because there was a discrepancy there. And if you read back in the literature and the history, he salvaged for the state of Texas to the good over 200,000 acres of land because the boundary line was off by so many feet on the Red River.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So it's a cool story. So he fought in the Battle of the Running Scrape. He was a signer. In fact, if you look at the Texas Declaration of Independence on the right-hand column, you'll see my ancestor's name right below Sam Houston.
Wow.
Yep.
Yeah, that's
cool.
Man, that's as bad as Texan as you can get.
Yeah, man. It's really interesting, but a little bit of history book there for you about Texas. So if you're listening we've got people that listen from Ireland and people that listen from Australia and France, and so if you're listening today, you found out a little bit about Texas,
Right? And to our Scottish listener,
yes,
I drank some scotch yesterday. I had a Balvenie.
16?
American oak is I think what it was called. So they aged it in American oak casks.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it was good. Quite good.
I just bought a new bottle of whiskey called Legent. I
Legent.
don't know anything about it. I'm going to try it, but it is aged in wine and sherry cask.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm going to try that. It might be a little sweet.
I like sherry cask
Yeah.
aged. Anything that's aged in sherry cask, I've liked.
Yeah, I'm gonna try that. Also got me another bottle of High West rye. I like their Rendezvous rye.
Rendezvous
it's really
rye.
good.
Yeah,
it's really
good stuff.
Good
Good
Pretty
stuff.
reasonable too. But yeah, man, today we're going to talk about, over the next several episodes, we're going to be covering some programming and equipment and movement let's just say, alterations or adaptations that we make as coaches, that we choose as coaches to allow for lifters and trainees to have the maximum experience in their strength training program. And today we're going to talk about these bad immobile shoulders, or sometimes the hyperflexible shoulders, and the squat, and some of these other movements. Generally, it's the squat, the press, and the bench press that we've got to be concerned with.
Right.
The deadlift is not as involved. I mean, the shoulder's involved in the deadlift, obviously, but bad shoulders usually don't have a problem in the deadlift.
It's not a limitation.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, because there's very little range of motion in that movement. I mean, you're going from basically 60 degrees of flex posture to standing in a neutral posture. So not a big deal. So that's what we're going to cover today. And then in several episodes moving forward, we're going to cover how we've adapted with specific case studies, individuals to the movement and the movement to the individuals, and equipment and so forth.
Yeah, so we'll talk about backs, knees, hips, all that kind of stuff, and what we do to kind of change the program as needed.
Right.
So
let me first preface this podcast by saying this. As coaches, as strength coaches, we always are going to try to stay with the non-sexy standard thing on the front end. We're not just, I see this common mistake made by a lot of strength coaches, a lot of fitness trainers, and what they will do is they will get a client in the door. The client gives them a medical history, starts talking to them about the problems or issues that they might have, and then they automatically on the front end adapt the training to that individual subjective reports, their medical history, what they complain they can't do, or what joints they have issues with, without even trying what I would call the normal thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I think that's a disservice to the client and also to the process. I think what we should do is, and I really learned this through Starting Strength when I did my very first seminar years ago in 2011 or 12, I think. I think it's been 8 or 9 years. But what I was intrigued by was the lack of adapting the program to individuals versus letting individuals adapt to the program.
Right.
And so when you go through your seminar, or you read the blue book, or you study anything within Starting Strength, you see that we try to keep it fairly normative because we know that works.
Yeah.
That works with 99.9% of the people. So why not do what works with the majority of the people up front? And then if it doesn't work, you can modify that intervention to best meet the client's needs. But let's first do what we know works.
Exactly. And, maybe the most common example that nearly everyone that starts the novice linear progression encounters is, oh, my shoulders are not flexible enough to get in the low bar position.
Yeah, that's really common.
And, my shoulders don't feel flexible enough if I take off a week from squatting. Yeah. Everybody is stiff, and nobody does that position in everyday life. And so that's something everyone struggles with. But we know that the vast majority of people, if they just take a couple weeks to adapt to that and just kind of push through the discomfort a little bit, then they'll be fine. Right.
Yeah, and I think that's a perfect way to start this out, and for us to talk about shoulder immobility and clients that we've worked with that have either had shoulders that have pathologies, in other words, they have injuries that are lifelong injuries that they're dealing with. They've got reconstructive procedures. They're a dislocator. They're a repeat, what I call a repeat offender dislocator. They got hyperlax joints.
Yeah,
the joints are real loose, and so what do we do to adapt training to them, so that we can eventually get adaptation in them, get them stronger, and get them reaching their fitness goals? Well, the first thing we do is nothing. The first thing we do is when we do a startup session with anyone is we bring them in, we go through squat, press, deadlift, bench press, and we see how their body adapts to the intervention through the different movement points and the form criteria for those movements. So if I get someone in and we get ready to back squat them and they just can't get the bar low enough on their back to get the bar on the posterior deltoid shelf to get it where we want it over the hips, then I number one, I try to force the bar down there and they'll say, oh, that hurts. And I'll say, yes, it does. And so I try to gauge that based on each individual. What can they really tolerate? If someone's really wincing and they're really not, they're not handling it well, I might bring the bar up a little higher to start with or I'll widen the grip. Significantly widen the grip. And sometimes I'll also allow a thumbs around the bar approach.
Right.
So that's the thing that I do immediately with shoulder and mobility issues. If I just can't get the bar down low enough in a standard grip width, in a standard grip position, number one thing I do is I widen the grip. The second thing I do was I will let them go with thumbs around the bar.
Yeah.
That's another adaptation. And then the last thing that I would do as an intervention is the way that I approach this in my mind. First of all, let me just say this. From a construct, the last thing that I always allow the trainee to do in regards to adapting an exercise to them is the thing that I know that's going to change the mechanics,
right,
or the physics, that's going to alter the physics of that movement the most against them.
Yes.
And the number one thing in that, in all these changes or these adaptations, would be to raise the bar higher on their back.
Right.
If I let them do that right off the bat, then I've automatically changed the bar path potentiality, or where the bar path's going to be. In relationship to
changing
the hip
the amount of muscle, of muscle mass that's involved.
I move it from a low bar, a squat. I move it from a squat to a high bar squat immediately. So that would be the last thing that I would allow them to adapt to. And then, like I said, then the last thing would be, I'm going to allow them to roll the bar a little bit up their back,
right?
Not to a full high bar position. If they can tolerate having it just an inch up higher, kind of a hybrid.
Maybe like the base of their traps.
Yeah,
kind
of a hybrid type squat. I'll let them do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Last ditch effort, I'll allow them to do high bar, and we'll do a high bar squat. But we'll still kind of approach the high bar based on their back length segment, with a little bit more bent over posture and hip drive out of the bottom to best simulate what we're really working towards long term.
Right.
Now, the other thing is if they got a really short back and long femurs, they might be able to do a high bar and do an actual low bar movement.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, just because of the way they're put together.
And and I've noticed too, I'm going to talk about this trainee in a minute. I've noticed too that if they have the opposite, a long torso and short femur, then there's not that much difference between their high bar and low bar squat anyway in terms of their back angle. And so they usually can tolerate a high bar squat better because their cues aren't going to be drastically different. Whereas someone with your example that has the short torso, long femur, they're very bent over. And so their back angle is going to change more dramatically with a bar position change. And that might throw them off. And so that's the other element of this, is not only does it change the physics of the lift and the amount of muscle mass that you're engaging, it also changes the mental model that the lifter has. And that can be really, really tough for someone who's brand new to lifting to do. Is if they learn how to low bar squat, or if you teach them in day one the hip drive and bending over and shoving your butt back, and then you immediately switch them to a high bar position because of shoulder mobility, well, now you might have to throw those cues out the window. So the whole teaching progression that you've done is now compromised, because they may need to be more upright, more chest up, Now, the other thing that we could do as coaches, so we've talked about already changing the grip position, widening it. We've talked about going with the thumb around grip position, so that the thumb goes around so the shoulders can handle that. We've also talked about raising the bar up a little bit. I also will give them the bar stretch. I think everybody's calling that now the horn stretch. Yeah, he has a video. Paul Horn has a video of how to do it. But yeah.
It's just a stretch. We've all been doing this stretch, and basically it's you get up under the bar, and I have my clients do that daily.
Yes,
you get up under the bar and you drop that bar as low as you can get it, and you stretch in that position for 30 seconds to a minute.
Right.
And I like to do that for 3 to 5 times per day, daily. And keep working. And a lot of my clients say, well, I'm really, really sore today. Should I still do that stretch? Absolutely.
Yes.
Because when you're sore is when you're going to adapt the best, as long as you can get it down there.
And and the frequency is the key there. If you have a compromised range of motion in your shoulders, you've got to do it every day. A couple times a day, 3 times a day.
If you miss 2 days, 3 days, you've adaptively shortened again.
Just doing it on your training days is not enough.
Yeah, and if you get really sore and then you don't want to do it for 3 or 4 days and you don't, you went backwards.
That's right.
Because now you got this connective tissue that's tightened back up. But But yeah, so the last thing that I allow trainees to do would be to use a piece of assistive equipment like a safety bar. So I might go with the safety bar. I might go with something like the safety bar, the Buffalo bar.
Yeah.
I might use them an adaptive piece of equipment because we just can't get, I've got one guy that had hypermobile shoulders. One trainee, he would sublux easily, and he could self-dislocate. It wasn't painful anymore, but it's just not good for his labrum, not good for his joints. So we just chose very early on in his training to use a safety bar for squats. And, I hated that was the case, but until we potentially could build him some muscle mass around those shoulders to see if that would help improve the inherent stability or the natural stability of that joint, we had to modify things.
Right.
So we used a safety bar right out of the gates. It doesn't happen very often, but that is one thing I did.
That'd be a pretty rare example, but it's not a So I think going back to our first point, that the vast majority of people can and should get into a low bar squat position. It's going to require some discomfort, and you have to know that up front. And hopefully your coach has communicated that to you. It's like that we don't want pain, but there is going to be quite a bit of discomfort involved and sore shoulders. But if you just give it some time, give it a few weeks, you will adapt to it.
And don't bias yourself. Don't bias yourself or your coach when you walk in the door to say, I have all these problems and you have to adapt the program to me.
Yeah, don't expect them to change the program.
A good coach would not do that. And if your coach is doing that, they're not a good coach. I'm just telling you, that is not good science. It's not good logic and reason. What we want to do is first trial the movement in a exposure without danger environment where we can see if the trainee can adapt to it. And sometimes it's uncomfortable. I haven't found too many trainees that are older males over the age of, let's say, 40 or 50 that haven't gotten into the low bar or that lower bar position on the squat and haven't felt uncomfortable.
Yeah, almost everyone
That is the norm. Yeah. Now, I don't want you to be dying, but, like we talked about with Jay in our last episode, I believe, he has a detached labrum in his shoulder. So when we got one of the adaptations or modifications we made to his program was when he got into the lower bar position on the squat, his shoulder was killing him when we went up to a weight that we knew his hips and back could tolerate. That was 115. We were like, well, I know your legs and your hips and your back can tolerate this. You've got enough trunk strength. But his shoulder couldn't tolerate it. So we started him at 95. Exactly. And that was the weight where he said, yeah, it hurts a little, but I can do that. And now we're squatting 240, 245.
Yeah.
You know what happened? If that guy had any other coach, and I'm patting ourselves on the back on this one, but if that guy had any other coach, he would have completely modified that movement, and that would have done him a disservice to not use the best exercise to get him the biggest gains, the fastest, and use the most efficient way to do it.
Yeah.
And so I mean, it's a perfect example.
And I love that you mentioned that sometimes we miss some of the easiest modifications program.
Oh, yeah.
You just lowered the weight.
Yeah.
Right? We just
and that's another program. That's another modification we do with the bad shoulder.
That's a valid modification, and we do that all the time. And that's the way that linear progression looks like in practice. It's lumpy. It's lumpy, right?
Right. It's like a roller coaster.
But that's absolutely. Like, you start off and some body parts are stronger than others. Some just they have tissue mobility limitations, all sorts of stuff, right? And so in practice, oftentimes we have to keep the weight artificially low at the start, or we have to maybe slow down the rate of adaptation for one lift. They might be capable of 10, 15 pound jumps for the first few weeks, but we have to make them 5 because of their shoulders.
I would like to say that the process is carefully malleable.
That's right.
Meaning that we can adapt the process to you if we absolutely have to, but it will be the last thing that we will do.
Yes.
Because it has the greatest impact of deviating us away from the things that we know with 99.9% of the trainees work.
Right.
So, but we do these things sometimes. Like with Jay, the idea was, well, if we squat him at 115, his shoulder might be killing him in the next 2 or 3 days, and then we've lost him. We've lost him mentally and physically.
Right. That's right. And when you really look at it in the context, in the bigger context of he's been training for 3 months now, right?
Yeah, he's crushing
just
it, man.
starting him 20, 25 pounds lighter than he could have. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter one bit.
No.
3 months later, he's strong. It didn't slow him down, but a week.
Yeah,
it doesn't
it took
matter.
him about a week and a half to get back up to where he was going to be anyway.
Exactly.
And so we got a little bit of neural recruitment learning, and he got better with the movement. As he got better, the shoulder hurt less.
That's the important thing, is even going slow is fast in the long term.
Also recognize with the squat, with some of these junky shoulders, these immobile, tight shoulders, you might also run into some problems, and we've had this with several trainees. Here at our gym, Donnie was a great example. You might have a higher elbow position. The elbows flaring a little bit more above the line of the trunk more. We'd like to see the elbows no more than about 20 to 30 degrees above the trunk line in regards to the change in angle.
Right.
But you might have an elbow that's out there at 45, 60 degrees above the trunk. And that's just because they cannot get that shoulder down and around to tuck those elbows down. So you want to be working on that, and you want to be really getting them forcefully into that position. But for a while, you might have to deal with that. Now, because of that, the one thing that I do as a coach is I'm real particular with them, and I tell them light hands, light hands. Because the tendency to want to push down on that bar with immobile shoulders is really high.
Yes.
Because the elbows are flaring. The bar is going to have a tendency to feel like it's going to move forward a little bit, roll forward and up the back a little bit. So they're going to want to pull the bar down with their grip and place it in position with their hands. The hands are merely you just resting your hands there. The bar is being held by your back.
Yeah.
Not by your arms.
And that posterior deltoid.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's a great point. And if you think about it, when the shoulder is in, I always get these backwards, extension.
Yeah,
hyperextension or
extension.
Overextension, and that because the elbows are real high. A lot of stress
on the biceps.
Yeah, the bicep tendon, the origin of those bicep tendons is really stretched out over that.
Well, and it's under an isometric load too.
Yes.
When you think about it, you can produce the greatest amount of force with a muscle belly and a tendon under an isometric load. And because of that, it's isometric, eccentric, concentric. That's the progression of force production. Regards to highest to lowest. So that puts a tremendous amount of force on that proximal long head of the biceps tendon and on that distal bicep tendon attachment, and then also on the forearm extensors, like you get tennis elbow, because you're gripping that bar with a death grip.
Yes,
and so your forearm musculature in an isometric holding death grip. So you really got to focus on light hands on the bar.
And the double whammy is a lot of these guys too. Is they're, in addition to that high elbow position, they're also having to take a wide grip on the bar. So then they don't get the benefit of that forearm compression holding the bar into place. And they have a smaller shelf in the back too, the deltoid shelf. So there's a benefit. There's a balance there with a good coach will slowly work your elbows in each training session. As they see that you're getting to that position better and better, and you're able to get your elbows down more and more, then they'll tell you, hey, narrow your grip an inch, narrow your grip an inch, one finger at a time even. And this is where, again, modifying the starting weight can be really important. So if you have to take this really wide grip and you do have that high elbow position, that's the best you can do, then you probably do want to start with a lighter weight so that you're not putting that tendon of your biceps tendon under all of that isometric load. And by the time you get to a weight that is more challenging, that maybe you could have started with for your back and your hips, now you've got a little bit narrower grip and a better shelf.
Yeah, and our number one goal as we progress through these loads, these weights get heavier and heavier and heavier as a coach. We want to try to fix these problems early on in the process, but we need to adapt you to the process, not the process to you. But again, like I said, these are some of the things that we do as coaches with bad shoulders. We've done it with a bunch of clients. But that last thing would be equipment modification, which would be things like a safety bar. I also might, to give someone's shoulders a rest, if they had a really bad shoulder, but I want to keep them moving in the squatting motion, I go to my leg press.
Yes, yeah.
That'd probably be the last thing I would do is
Right.
I'd go to my leg press, and most people don't have a leg press in their garage, but they can have a safety bar. But so I might go to my leg press, so I'm still driving load in the hips and the legs and part of the trunk, but I'm letting the shoulder rest.
Yeah, I have a young guy that's really struggling with biceps tendonitis right now, and
He needs to eat more.
he does. Yeah, see that's the thing, right? It's
Your
the simplest
connective tissue and your muscle does not adapt unless you feed it.
unless you're pounding that protein. Yeah, 100%. But yeah, we're going to take a week off from squatting to just leg press and drive the deadlift and maybe do some low.
He can wipe the tears from his eyes.
That's right. Some low rep, high set chin ups. Just try to get some work in there and move. So we're not going to stop moving. We're going to use all of those body parts, but we're just going to take the squat away for just a week.
And eat a lot of food.
And eat a lot of food. Yeah. I like that. So, the high bar squat, I've found myself, if I have a guy who I've done all of these modifications to, and it's been a few weeks and they are still getting pain in their shoulder and maybe the biceps tendon as well, then I might decide to go to a high bar squat. And I'll give you an example. I
would do that before I would go to a safety bar squat.
Yes, 100%. So I've got a guy right now who's, he's in his early 40s, former baseball player. So he's got a shoulder that's
a lot of connective tissue
taking
junk.
some pounding. Yeah, he was a college baseball player, really powerful guy. Yeah. He's explosive. He just moves with
Josh?
power. No, it's Chris.
Oh yeah, okay.
And
we're using actual case studies here, people.
That's right.
These are real people.
And so we worked on the low bar position. It was okay at lighter weights. And I told him, we were kind of keeping the weight artificially low to give his shoulder time to adapt. He did his stretches. So he's kind of doing all the right things. And his shoulder just was not recovering from session to session. In addition to that, this particular trainee, his ability to get his squat up high is much greater than the typical person I have here.
He had a better strength foundation.
He's got a great strength foundation. Yeah. He's an explosive guy. So he's going to leave a lot of weight on the table if we keep trying to struggle through a low bar squat. And I have to hold him back so much. So I got the impression that we're leaving, 50, 60, 70 pounds on the table right now in the next couple of weeks if I don't adjust his squat grip to help his shoulder out. So in this case, it made sense to move to a high bar squat. And again, we're using kind of a hybrid position. It's not on top of his traps. It's kind of at the base of his traps above the spine of the scapula. And he's using a thumbs around grip so he can really make a nice tight shelf. And it kind of works with his anthropometry. He's got a long trunk, real short legs. So he's already fairly upright when he squats. So it wasn't a big adjustment in terms of his learning to stay on the midfoot and keep his balance and his eye gaze and all that kind of stuff. It didn't have to change all that much. So there you go. There's one specific example of a guy that has benefited from the high bar squat. But even then, even though this guy's really uniquely suited to it, I still went through all the modifications to try to get him to low bar first. Yeah.
No, and I think that's good coaching. We try to adapt him to the process, and when we can adapt him and we really work hard at doing that, we don't just allow the trainee to make that decision most of the time, unless we know we're going to lose them.
Right.
Then if we can't adapt them to the process, then we adapt the process to them, knowing too that we might get less than effective results,
right,
or less effective results. Yeah, I guess I should say that we're still going to get results.
Let me put it this way: if the same guy had come to me, but he was very detrained and didn't have as high of a starting point, then I would have just kept the weight low, and we still would have worked in the low bar position. The main driver for me for the change, deciding to make the change, was the fact that he's leaving a ton of weight on the table if we don't get him moving efficiently. So
how old is he?
Early 40s, I think. No, I think he's about to turn 40. He's about to join the 40
club.
Nation. Yeah.
He's about to join the club. So we talked about the squat a little bit with the bad shoulder or the hypomobile shoulders. Now let's talk about the press. The press is one of those things that I think Trent and I would both agree that with 99.9% of our clients, unless they're just athletic, and specifically in our older population, we do a 1.0 strict press first instead of teaching the hip drive press
for a while.
Because we top that out basically, and then we add the hips in later. Just because we find that movement is harder to learn. It's not, everyone can learn it, but it's harder to learn. And sometimes we want to focus just on that strict press first, the 1.0 press. And then we go to the 2.0 or maybe even the 1.5 where we allow them to rest at the top and bounce off the bottom.
Right.
But the number one thing with the press that I see that's the biggest issue is the hypomobile shoulder, the tight shoulder. So they can't really get the bar in the bottom position. A lot of times they can't get the elbows as far forward as we need them to be, so that the elbows are in front of the grip, the bar, which is our standard rack position.
Yes.
And it also at the top of full extension or overhead lockout, the bar is in front of them. It's not back over the midfoot, like right at the ear level,
right,
into full flexion over their head where the bar is kind of centered. So because of that, there's an increase in the moment arm between the shoulder joint and the bar or the load, and we have an increase in the moment arm. 95 pounds can feel like 115.
Yes.
Or 65 pounds can feel like 45.
And especially at lockout, you think of the moment arm from the midfoot to the bar.
Right.
If they only have 160 degrees of shoulder flexion,
right,
that bar is fairly forward their midfoot at lockout,
right,
and that can easily pull them forward.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so now what you'll see is you'll see these lifters have a tendency to lean back more. They'll have a tendency to hyperextend a little bit in the top position. And so they'll have a tendency to try to arch their upper thoracic spine a little bit more. And they might get some, what I call junctional pain in between the thoracic and lumbar area, right there, kind of in the center of their back, just at the base of their shoulder blades where the T12L1 vertebrae intersection is.
Yeah.
They'll pivot back on that and they'll get some centralized mid-back pain because they're kind of forcing those two vertebrae together. So the first thing we do again is we drive the squat. We try to drive the squat in the proper bar and shoulder back position because that helps their mobility. I also use the chin up early on, specifically the chin up because of the way it positions the forearm and the shoulder and stretches the lats.
Yes, yeah.
And I make sure that they're getting really good flexion at the bottom of the hang position. They're really opening that shoulder and letting that shoulder joint stretch in the bottom. So I might do a hanging stretch too with them.
Yeah.
But really, in regards to adapting the press, unless they just have a terrible shoulder, I just have them press, and they're going to be less effective, less efficient at the press. Now, one thing that I have done with very few clients, but that I have done, is instead of doing a strict press overhead, I've let them go to something like an incline press.
Yeah, yeah.
Where they just can't. I mean, I've had a couple clients where they have no shoulder range of motion.
Right, yeah. I mean,
they just can't get there.
If you've got 155, 160 degrees of shoulder flexion, you're going to be so far. The moment arm's going to be so long. You're going to lock out so far in front of your midfoot. Right. You're not going to be able to do it with any weight.
It's an incline press, basically.
It's already an incline press, yeah. But yeah, to your point, I've had a lot of people come in that day one they might have, let's say, 170 degrees of shoulder flexion. I actually have an older gentleman who came in day one with probably something like 165 degrees of shoulder flexion. And just by using the empty bar and focusing on shrugging at the top of the movement,
I was about to say that. Yeah,
by the end of the workout, he's getting the bar up to 170, maybe 175. You know,
the movement will drive the range of motion.
That's right.
The movement, because it's under load too.
It is.
So the best way to stretch joints, it's one of our stretching principles for flexibility and mobility, is to drive joint range of motion and connective tissue flexibility and joint mobility through stretch under load.
Yeah. So
that's what you're doing.
If you're listening to this and you're one of those people that you just can't get the bar back over your midline at the top, just focus on the shrug at the top
shrug.
And
get
as big as you can. And over the course of your sets, even if you just do the empty bar for a few workouts, I bet you'll gain at least 5 degrees of range of motion.
You know, people want to sex this stuff up. They want to make it, they want to do like a 19-point mobility program that takes 45 minutes each day before they go do their strength workout.
Yeah.
You don't need that, folks. And I'm not trying to be a simpleton. I mean, anyone who knows me knows that, I got a brain. It's not very big, but I do have a brain.
Yeah.
And I don't choose the simple approach just to be simple. I choose a simple approach because it works.
It works.
It works. Why make this more difficult than it has to be? You want the best return on your investment for time and energy and effort. So the movement itself and a lot of these movements will gain the mobility that you need over time. Now, as a coach, what we have to make sure that we do is don't accelerate that process to the point to where we're causing problems with painful joints and other issues.
Yeah. So a good example there. One of the things I'm thinking about is bang for the buck, right? To your point of simplicity. There's another trainee that I've worked with that I believe you're now working with that came in with about 170 degrees of shoulder flexion. And he had been told by another PT, not yourself, not your clinic, but just a different PT, correct. That he should never press overhead because of that.
Right.
Should avoid overhead pressing.
Right. Which, let me just tell you this: that is not a updated form of thinking in the physical therapy world and the physiotherapy world when we talk about overseas too. The new way of thinking is you may have some dysfunction in movement, but you can still strengthen and load that movement, even though it's not perfect movement.
Right.
We didn't used to think that. And we used to teach, we got to perfect the movement first, get all the movement working right, and then we'll put you under load. Now we know, no, you can start, you don't have to have perfect movement to put under load.
Yeah, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good.
Right, exactly.
And that's exactly what we did. I said, well, we could just start light. Let's just start with the empty bar and let's just see where it goes, right? Yeah. And I think he pressed 95 pounds, somewhere around there. Now, of course, he's always going to have that limitation where at the end of LP, he's going to be artificially limited in his ceiling for the press by his range of motion. And you can't do anything about that. But hey, why not ride it and see how far you can go, and then we can figure something else out. We got lots of other ways to make that movement difficult if you can't just keep adding weight to the bar. Yeah,
he's 67, and I think we're pressing over 100 now for triples. For 5 sets of 3, we're pressing over 100. So.
As you think about,
and we just started back with COVID-19.
Yeah,
and he had both of his hips replaced also this spring.
Right.
And we're squatting. I think we're squatting 125 or 130.
Oh, fantastic!
And he just had both of his hips replaced.
Yeah. Well, credit to him. I mean, he really gets after it in the gym, and he hasn't let that double hip replacement, stop him or keep him out of the gym. So.
Yeah. Now, the other thing I like to do too is I like to do this one particular bar stretch. It's a rack stretch, just to teach the client also how to get the right path of movement, the bar path.
Yeah.
So I won't take the bar, but I'll take a wood dowel or stiff PVC, like a Schedule 40 PVC, a thicker PVC.
Okay.
And I'll have them get in the rack position, stand at the rack, walk into the rack until the object that I'm using, the dowel or the rod that I'm using, presses into the rack, and then I'll have them press following the rack all the way up. And lean into it and stretch and shrug at the end.
Yeah, so
and then I'll load that a little bit on a bar, and that way we're following the right bar path and we're stretching the movement along with loading the movement.
Yeah.
So we're getting the best of both worlds.
I like that. Yeah, that forces a straight vertical bar path
as straight
on
as
the
possible.
way up. Yeah, that's good.
So I'll do that too in the press. But worst case scenario, they've just got a shoulder where they just can't press at all. Then we go to the incline, and then we're going to talk about the bench press.
Yeah. And one last note about the press. One common form mistake that I see that causes bar path issues, especially in people with limited shoulder mobility, is trying to start with the bar too low.
Yeah.
And because they feel like they can't get their elbows forward of the bar in the starting position. Well, a lot of times it's just because they're starting with the bar too low for their forearm length anyway. For most people, it will be floating above the chest.
Right.
Not many people can rest the bar on their chest and have a good elbow position.
Right, it'll be in between the chin. I tell people it's in between the chin and the clavicle.
That's
basically.
Right. And for those people that have limited mobility, I often will have them take the bar right up underneath their chin to where I always try to make them get it underneath the chin, not above that. That's cheating. But I'll just tell them, take it right up underneath the chin, put it right up underneath by the base of your throat, and that almost everyone can get their elbows just in front of the bar. Now, the tightest individuals that I work with can just barely get their elbows forward. They have to really focus on it, but they can.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely got to be volitional. They have to think about it.
They have to really focus on it.
It doesn't happen just naturally positional.
Right.
The other thing that I would say is this, and we've talked about this several times, and I would apply this to any movement in our gym. if you've got a guy or a lady that comes in and for whatever reason, they've got hip capsule tightness that's been there for years, they're in their 60s or 70s or whatever, or their 40s, 50s, whatever it is. Let me give you a good example. I had a client that I trained for several years who's crazy strong. She's an amazingly strong client. I think she's 50 plus now. She was a CrossFit athlete. She was an Olympic lifter. She's been she's been a power lifter too. This woman is really strong, but she played high school, college, and also in the military, she played soccer.
Oh, okay.
So she played at a very high professional level soccer.
Yeah.
Her knees were so osteoarthritic that she could not flex her knees beyond, let's say, 105 to 110 degrees. We tried everything. Her knees were stuck, basically. Tight capsules, osteoarthritic bones, just, calcific problems, stuck.
Did you try WD-40?
Yeah, no WD-40.
Shoot.
But she was just stuck. So, but we still got her right at almost a legal squat because she was a CrossFit competitor.
Yeah.
So we had to get her down in the squat to call it a real squat. So what we would do is the nice thing was she had a natural, knee bend and stop because she could go nowhere else.
Yeah.
So we taught her how to squat, and we would just slide her hips back as far as we could without her falling over.
Yeah.
And she would get right at close to parallel.
Bam.
But here's my thinking with all these movements. So that I want everybody to hear this. If I have a client who's not going to be a competitor, so we're not worried about the movement meeting a certain criteria for depth or lockout or whatever, but they just want to get reasonably strong. And let's say they squat 2 inches high, and that's the best we can get because of a joint pathology, because of arthritis, because of some other problem. Fine. That's great.
Yeah.
Because that's their functional range of motion anyway. It's the same with the press. If they just they have a big thoracic kyphosis, big rounded back, and they're never going to be able to get into full lockout, I don't care because at least I'm making them strong in their available range of motion.
That's right.
I don't have to, I want to try to adapt them to the process and the movement criteria as much as I can. And when I find as a clinician or as a coach that we've gotten as far down that road we're going to go, then I'm good with that.
Sometimes with my clients, I'll take them aside and I'll whisper in their ear.
You're sounding kind of creepy right now.
It's okay if you squat a little high.
Yeah, I told the guy that the other day.
I'm like, hey, this is between you and me. Don't be telling everybody else, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that client that you used to have that I have now with the bilateral hip replacement.
Right. Yeah.
If he squats 2 inches high and he's squatting 160 pounds, what do I care?
Right, yeah.
That is lower than any chair he's going to go to.
How many people with double hip replacements are squatting at all?
Zero.
With anything?
Zero, except for my patients.
That's right. So that's a huge win, yeah. And don't let sometimes people will, because squat depth is one of those things that everybody sees the hip crease below top of the patella, and people can see squat depth easier than other things.
And that's what we want to shoot for.
And we want to shoot for that. Absolutely. I don't let people get away with high squats. But if it's somebody that we've worked on it,
right,
and that's the best they can do, then I'm okay. As long as they are consistent.
Right.
They better be hitting that spot that I know they can hit every time.
Yeah. So let's talk about the bench press now. So bench press modifications, to start with, I think we need to make sure that our client is using the proper bench press form that we teach, which is a lower elbow, 70-degree upper arm to trunk angle. We want to make sure that they're keeping a big chest. All the movement criteria that we focus on our bench.
Yeah.
That fixes 90% of the shoulder problems in the bench.
The arch is almost all of the bench press. There's not much more to it than that.
The elbow position, the bar path, going from the shoulder to the chest to the shoulder, back to the shoulder, the leg drive, all of these things. When people tell me, they come in and they say, I can't bench, I got a bad shoulder. I'm like, all right, well, let's just do the bar and let's do the bench the way we teach it. And then all of a sudden they're benching weight.
Yeah.
And so, the movement itself is going to solve a lot of those bad shoulder problems.
It will. Yeah.
Now, let's say we just can't get them to do the normal movement in the bench. Then the first adaptation that I make with most bad shoulders would be a narrow grip bench where there's less shoulder mobility requirement. There's more recruitment with the triceps, more recruitment with the anterior deltoid. They can still use their lats, but I narrow their grip a little bit. I allow them to drop their elbows a little bit more. And that seems to resolve some of the problems.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we'll do that. So that would be the first thing I do would be narrow the grip a little bit.
Yeah. And I have a question there actually for you. So I've noticed just anecdotally that if someone's dealing with that distal biceps pain in the bench press, I know the biceps is a co-contractor along with the tricep, and the
bicep is active in the bench.
It's very stretched out, at the bottom of the bench press, and that's some clients will get just a really sharp pinching sensation down there. And I've noticed that switching them to a narrow grip bench press seems to alleviate that.
Well, that shortens the length of the bicep overall because you're bringing the arm down
that makes
to
sense.
Your side more.
Yeah,
so
even
the long head gets shortened, and the part of the short head too. So.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. So that's something too. It's not specific to the shoulder, but it's if you're dealing with that elbow issue.
Now let's say that someone just has they get to the bottom of the bench, they can't quite go that deep because of mobility or pain. Then instead of going to the narrow grip at first, I might just do a partial range bench where I put a board. I do a board bench, board
press,
where I put the board on them or an object on them, and I let them bench to that. And we do a short and ranged for a while. We build up that connective tissue. We build up that shoulder strength and mobility under load, and then sometimes that will fix the problem too before I have to go to a narrow grip. I can't do a normal grip width bench anymore, but I can narrow grip bench, and I'm benching lifetime PRs.
Yeah.
Narrow grip.
Now, do you find for you, is it because of that tenodesis that you have? Just they screwed your bicep tendon over here somewhere?
Well, no, it's mostly just because my shoulder can't handle that lever arm.
Yeah.
The farther the elbow gets out away from the body, the lever arm gets longer.
Right.
So I like that shorter lever arm. My shoulder just can't handle the force. The anterior structures, the labrum, the long head of the biceps, it's been hammered too much.
Yeah.
So I just feel more comfortable. I still have some pain with a narrow grip, but it's not as bad. And like I said, I'm hitting some good numbers, so why not?
So just like we talked about with the squat in the bar position, you've got a range of grips you can take on the bench press. So the standard width for most people is going to be somewhere around that inner ring of the barbell, maybe
forearm vertical,
maybe on it, maybe slightly inside it. That would be standard grip, but you don't have to go all the way to the beginning of the knurl on the inside. You could go somewhere in between.
Right.
And there's actually a pretty good range of options.
Find what works for you.
So play around with that. Try an inch in, inch out.
Yeah, so I would use the board press too. I would use a grip modification. I sometimes will use different programming, and then I'll drive intensity, heavier loads to build the hypertrophic to build the connective tissue and still get adaptation and strength. But then I'll do back offsets with lighter loads where the force in the joint is less. But I'll always use, a couple heavy singles, big singles, doubles, to try to drive a stimulus of growth in that shoulder and the pec and the lat. And
that's a great point. That can really help with it's natural to lose the arch that you create in the setup over the course of the set. And rep 4 and 5 can really get, for some people that just don't have that strength in the lats to pull anchor their shoulders and keep them pulled together. Rep 4 and 5 can get a little sketchy if they completely lose their shoulders.
Right.
So if they could do 2 or 3 really solid reps, make them do that.
Right.
And until they build that lat strength from the other exercises that we're doing, like the deadlift.
Right.
And they'll come back later on, 2 months later, and be a much stronger bencher.
Yeah, and we haven't talked about this with the press, but I do it with the bench sometimes too, and that is go to dumbbells. I'll go to dumbbells too because when they come down, they can roll their grip width, and they can kind of supinate their hand and get in a neutral posture, and they tolerate that better. It's more like a narrow grip push-up on their fist, you know. And I will sometimes use the dumbbells overhead too. I find that the dumbbell overhead is not as effective as a barbell with shoulders that are less mobile. And because a lot of people are like, well, it seems, like that would be easier. No, because it requires more stability. It requires, so sometimes it doesn't work as well.
You got to be careful, when you lock out those dumbbells, if you're using any weight at all, you have to really control your bar
drop it
path
on your head.
Yeah. Well, and it can just easily yank I like to do dumbbells from time to time just for like hypertrophy, like big, 3 sets of 12 or whatever.
Mix it up.
And just for fun. But I can move some pretty heavy dumbbells.
Right.
But man, if I don't pay attention, I start to get tired, and I let them float away from my shoulder in any direction. Yep. Oh man, it can really yank on them. So
yeah, you definitely have to be paying attention with stability of the shoulder overhead more. So in the bench, those are some of the modifications that we can make: the board press, the narrowing of the grip, changing the programming a little bit. I will also go to do incline bench if flat bench is too painful. I'll do incline. I try to continue to drive their press along with the bench, and vice versa, the bench along with the press. And I find that doing all these things in sequence, like the bench, the press, the chins, the squat, the deadlift, all these things build the shoulder girdle, build shoulder mobility, shoulder stability, because all movement is predicated on 2 things, really 3 things: mobility, stability, and learning the movement. Stability is strength. Mobility is the natural movement of the joint through its full functional range of motion. And then learning how to actually do the movement through neural recruitment.
Motor pattern.
Learning the motor pattern. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. And that's the thing to keep an eye on the long term. Don't get, if you get frustrated in any given workout, stick with it for a few weeks at least before you start making these modifications, because what often happens, like we're talking about, is that other lifts are making you stronger in other areas, and they will support. They all drive each other up in certain ways. As your deadlift gets stronger, your lats are going to get stronger. You're going to be able to get a tighter arch and hold it better, and that's going to make your bench press stronger.
Make your chins better.
Make your chins better.
Yeah, all these movements, they
all interlock.
They're interconnected.
Yeah.
They're interdependent of each other. And so the other thing that I do that we haven't talked a lot about here is that I will use other assistive and accessory exercises, but that is a totally different conversation. Yeah. But I'll use things like Turkish get-ups. I'll use things like, planks. I'll use other shoulder mobility and shoulder stability exercises. But then we start to sex it up a little bit. It becomes more complicated. And I use that with specific clients.
Right.
But most of the time we can deal with the shoulder issues with just using this very simplistic approach and working through iterations of that and modifications and adapting the client to the movement and the movement to the client eventually if we have to.
I like that.
So,
hey, I saw something cool. I think I saw Charity do this. If you are at home and you've got a typical home setup where you've just got a rack and a bench and a bar, and you're wondering, like, well, how do I incline press? Do I have to go buy one of those $500 incline benches? Because they can be quite expensive.
Yeah.
No, you don't. If you've got an extra barbell, then put your pins at the right height. You can control the angle of the bench, and then take the foot. If you've got like a standard Rogue style flat bench with a solid foot on it, then just hook that end over the barbell that's sitting on the pins.
It's all pulling into the rack.
So now it's all pulling into the rack. It's actually pretty solid. Your feet will just go on the floor, and then so now you've created an incline press.
You don't have a seat necessarily,
right?
But the weight and your body will just stay on there, and you're working your legs at the same time.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so you kind of have to. It forces you to keep your leg drive going. Yeah. But that actually works pretty well. Yeah, it's cool. Not a bad way, and that's one less piece of equipment. You do need 2 barbells, so you may not have that, but that's a cool way to do that. One last question on the bench press. Do you ever just drop the bench press entirely?
Sure.
And just press?
Yeah, because if I've got one upper body movement that I can choose that's most functional, overhead press.
Okay.
And it also is the biggest driver of strength. It recruits more of the body. It recruits the entire kinetic chain from feet to fingertips. So I'll just drop the bench press. With a lot of my older clients that have wonky shoulders, painful shoulders, immobile shoulders, I'd rather drive the press than the bench press. And if I have to choose, then we're going to press.
Yeah.
Yep. Press and chins.
Me too.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Me too. All right, man. Well, thanks for joining 40 Fit Radio, and thanks for joining the 40 Fit Nation. If you want to hook up with us, guys, you can get to us at 40 Fit Radio on Instagram. Our email is info@40fit.com. Trent is at Marmalade Cream on Instagram. I'm at Dr. Deaton, and then we have a Facebook page, the 40 Fit Nation. Thanks for joining us today. Look for more podcasts on how we have worked with trainees, how we adapt training to trainees, and how we adapt trainees to training. All right, thanks, guys, for joining us.
Yeah, thanks. Talk to you next week.